Welcome. Today we are very honored to have Dr. Andrew Reinmann with us. He's an assistant professor of environmental sciences at the ASRC and Hunter College Department of Geography. Dr. Reinmann is an ecologist who has been studying the terrestrial carbon cycle, and today he's going to be discussing with us urbanization and fragmentation as mediators of forest growth and the carbon cycle in response to climate. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Reinmann, and we'll have a period for questions as soon as he's done.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'll do the share screen here, and all right, so you're seeing the presenter mode?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Looks great.
All right, well, this is great. This is really exciting. It sounds like a diverse group here, so which is always makes things a lot more interesting than just talking to the same old biologists all the time. I am sure, like I am, you are all a little bit on edge. So hopefully the next hour can be just a little bit of a positive distraction. We'll see. I joined CUNY in 2017, so I'm still relatively new. And over the past 4 or 5 years, my colleagues and I have been really interested in trying to understand how forest fragmentation and urbanization independently and collectively alter the way forests grow and function and provide a range of ecosystem services like carbon sequestration. And so today I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've been learning from this work over the past 4 or 5 years. So first, just to kind of get everyone up to speed on why, I guess from my end, a lot of the work that I do is focused on carbon cycling and the terrestrial carbon cycle in particular. So every year or two, there's a paper that gets put out by the same group where they sort of summarize our understanding of the global carbon budget. And sort of like the way an accountant would try and figure out kind of, where all the money that you or a business is bringing in, where all that money is going to, these scientists try and take a similar accounting approach to figuring out the global carbon cycle and the global carbon budget. And they publish figures something along the lines of what I'm showing here. And so what this is everything above the zero line represents carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere. And everything below the zero line represents, to our best understanding of the system, where all of that carbon dioxide is going. And so on top, of course, it's dominated by fossil fuels and cement production. And there's also this other piece, about 10–20%, that's from land use change. So land use change is when we convert forest to a non-forest area, and a lot of the carbon that was stored in the biomass gets emitted to the atmosphere. So where does all of that go? So a lot of us, we think a lot of it is just going into the atmosphere, and that's true, and that's what we're seeing here in the purple, but you'll notice that the amount of carbon dioxide residing in the atmosphere is actually quite a bit smaller than what we are emitting to the atmosphere. And so about half of all of our carbon dioxide emissions get taken up by oceans here in the blue, and by terrestrial ecosystems here in the green. And so this is showing you these dynamics over time. And notice a couple of things. First, the ocean and our terrestrial ecosystems actually remove a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the terrestrial ecosystems in particular remove about 1/3 of all anthropogenic emissions, right? So this is really important as we think about climate change mitigation, that because of all the carbon that our forests largely are removing from the atmosphere, that's effectively slowing the rate of climate change by about 1/3. The other thing that you'll notice here is that there's a lot of interannual variability in how much carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere each year. And that is, most of that variability is driven by interannual variations in what we call the strength of the land sink. In other words, how much carbon dioxide is removed by our terrestrial ecosystems each year. And that can vary considerably, largely based on prevailing climate conditions. So in some years, the size of that sink is massive. But in other years, our terrestrial ecosystems can even be a net source of carbon to the atmosphere. And that typically tends to be in these anomalous years, like some strong El Nino years where we're more likely to get drought and fires over a large proportion of the more arid regions of the planet. So like this year, with all of the forests in the western U.S. burning, that signal will be detected in atmospheric accumulations of carbon. And so because there's so much variability in how much carbon accumulates in the atmosphere, and a lot of that variability is driven by terrestrial ecosystems, a lot of my work is focused on trying to understand, well, what's driving that variability? What are the environmental conditions that seem to be mediating those variations? And a lot of my work, we look at these sorts of questions in temperate forests, and especially those forests that are heavily altered by human activities. So things like fragmentation, urbanization, and we even do a bit of research in rural systems, looking at the impacts of climate change. So historically, the places that ecologists tend to go to study the carbon cycle in forest ecosystems look a lot like these two images here. And so these images were taken from these long-term ecological research sites. The top one is in Michigan. The top left is in Michigan. The top right is Harvard Forest in central Massachusetts. These are both taken from towers where there's eddy flux systems set up. So these are these fancy pieces of equipment that effectively measure carbon dioxide moving in and out of the forest. And this is where we've made a lot of progress in our understanding of carbon cycling dynamics in forest ecosystems and how they respond to a variety of different environmental conditions. And so you'll notice that in both of these cases, and if I showed you a dozen more pictures of where these sites are located, it would look pretty similar. These are large intact forests. And then the way we go and quantify what our forests are doing globally, this is sort of an oversimplification of the process, but generally we make maps, we try and figure out where all the forests are in the world. And these are examples of that in these two maps. And then we use something of a sophisticated paint by number approach to say, okay, everywhere where there's forests of this type, we're going to assign it this value of carbon sequestration based on what we know about that sort of forest and how it responds to environmental conditions. But when we do this, we're often not taking into account things like forest configuration and the landscape context. So what I mean by that, by forest configuration, is it a large intact forest? Is it a heavily fragmented forest? And the landscape context, is it in a rural area or is it in an urban area? These things often aren't considered when we sort of are quantifying the strength of the forest carbon sink globally. And I think this is important because so now we're in this era of remote sensing, and we know what the Earth's land surface looks like, and we know how it's changing. And we have these amazing tools that we can use using satellite imagery. And a few years ago, a group published this paper and a map. We've amended the map a little bit for a later publication that we put out. That's what I'm showing here. But they did this work that quantifies the extent of fragmentation of the world's forests. And you can see in this map, so the reds are areas that are highly fragmented. Those are areas less than 100 meters or so from a forest edge. By a forest edge, I mean a patch of forest that's adjacent to another land cover that's not a forest. So that could be a grassland, it could be a city, it could be a body of water. And then in the dark blues, those are areas of large expanses of intact forest, things that are more than a kilometer from an edge. And a couple of things pop up. First, most of the intact forest that remain is in the tropics, particularly in the Amazon. And the forests in the rest of the world are very highly fragmented. In our part of the world, we can see the only place where we really have large expansive forests is really in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. And aside from that, there's not a whole lot in the eastern US. And so, that brings up this question that, so the forests are fragmented throughout the world. And so what do those numbers look like? So we know that 20% of all the remaining forests are within 100 meters of an edge, and 70% are less than a kilometer of an edge. We've done some more recent analyses in the northeast quarter of the US. That's the map I'm showing you here. And not surprisingly, we find that these dynamics are pervasive in the northeast. And in fact, we find that nearly a quarter of the forests are less than 30 meters of an edge. That number 30 meters will become important later in the talk. And we find that fragmentation is sort of ubiquitous in both urban and rural landscapes, and the drivers of fragmentation seem to be equally kind of from development and from agriculture. And so all of this, kind of gets us thinking, like if we're studying places that look like these top two images, but more and more of the landscape is looking like these bottom two images, is there then potentially this mismatch between the landscapes that we've been studying and maybe those that we're trying to characterize? So in other words, if we're quantifying carbon cycling dynamics in this little top patch of forest here, is it fair to assume that a same size area of forest that's in a fragment on the bottom left or a fragment on the bottom right, is it fair to assume that per unit area, they're all behaving the same? And there's a variety of reasons to think that they might not be. And this all sort of centers around the fact that when we take an intact forest and we sort of chop it up and create an edge with a non-forest land cover, we can radically alter the growing conditions of the forest that remain on the landscape. And so in this cartoon here, I'm going to just point out some of the changes in growing conditions that tend to occur when we create an edge. So first, we create that edge and we expose forests to much stronger winds. And in some ecosystems, this has been shown to increase rate of wind throw, so trees getting blown over, which of course is going to be bad for rates of forest growth and biomass accumulation. Also, at the forest edge, conditions are quite a bit hotter and drier than they are in the interior, and that can stress the forest ecosystem, it can stress the trees. And there's been some work to suggest that this can, in some cases, even induce tree mortality, but also just reduce rates of tree growth. So all of that, of course, is bad for rates of carbon accumulation and biomass. In tropical systems, they find that fragmentation can increase the prevalence of fire and the likelihood that fires will extend into forest ecosystems. So of course, if your trees are burning up, that's not a particularly good thing for carbon sequestration. But on the flip side, we all learn early in grade school that if you give plants more light, they can grow faster. And forests, when there's an edge, you're increasing the light availability. And so there's the potential there that the trees and the forest closer to the edge can grow faster, and that can maybe enhance rates of carbon sequestration. Similarly, there's been some work that suggests that the creation of forest edges can increase deposition of nutrients like nitrogen from that atmosphere. It's just because it changes sort of the surface roughness of the landscape. And nitrogen is an important resource that can limit rates of forest growth. And so if there's more there, then that could potentially stimulate forest growth. So just to kind of just summarize that, these forest edges, they can greatly alter the microenvironment, and what we see as you go from the forest interior to the edge, there's an increase in light and nutrient availability, the temperatures are warmer, vapor pressure deficit, or how dry the air is, increases, and exposure to wind increases, while soil moisture decreases. And so based on this, we sort of think of the creation of edges as kind of inducing this series of risks and opportunities for forest growth. And it's really how all of these different changes in microenvironment interact with one another, interact with sort of the prevailing climate conditions of a site, and interact with the forest itself that determines whether a forest might see higher growth rates or reduced growth rates in response to an edge. And so globally, while there's been a lot of work looking at how forest fragmentation impacts things like biodiversity, there really hasn't been a whole lot looking at how forest fragmentation alters biomass and forest growth. So what we do know, there's been a couple of studies in the tropics, and from there they find that the creation of an edge increases things like wind throw, proliferation of lianas. So these are vines that grow up the side of the forest, and increase drought and water stress. And these things collectively wind up reducing forest biomass. There's one study in the boreal forest, and so they're using Norway spruce. So these are shallow-rooted conifers. They find that you expose the trees to increased wind, and these shallow-rooted trees are more likely to blow over, and so that reduces biomass. But even though we find that the temperate forest biome is the most fragmented biome globally, there's been very little work looking at how fragmentation alters those dynamics. And so this has been the focus of a lot of our work over the past 4 or 5 years. And so the question that we have is how do temperate deciduous forests respond to non-forest edges? And we've been looking at this in both rural and urban landscapes. And so the data I'm going to show you today is largely derived from a series of field plots that we've set up in central Massachusetts, in the white box here, and a series of field plots that we set up in greater Boston here in the right. And the way we set these plots up is we find forest edges. They vary. Some are developed edges, some are agricultural edges. And each of these field plots is 20 meters wide along the edge, and they extend, most of them extend 30 meters into the forest, but we also have a series of plots that have gone deeper into the forest. What we're trying to figure out here is how far from the edge of the forest do you find the influence of those altered environment conditions and altered growing conditions. How far in does that influence forest growth? And so in each of these plots, we measure tree diameter and species composition, and we get forest biomass. And we've done this for 32 plots, actually up to 36 now if we include some of the ones in the New York area. In a subset of these plots, we've collected tree cores from every tree, and then we can measure the distance between the tree rings to figure out how fast individual trees are growing, and then collectively how fast the forest is growing. And then in a smaller number of plots in central Massachusetts, we've put out these little PVC collars in the soil, and we have an instrument that can then measure the amount of carbon dioxide coming out of the soil. And this is important because in forest ecosystems, we all know that they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, but a lot of that carbon dioxide just gets returned to the atmosphere from microbes decomposing things in the soil and the plants themselves metabolizing some of the sugars they produce. And so we get a lot of CO2 that comes back into the atmosphere, and a lot of that comes from the soil. So the idea here is if we can measure the net production of biomass in the trees, and we can also measure the amount of carbon being lost from the soil, we can come up with something of sort of like a carbon budget for our forests and understand how fragmentation influences that. So what do we find? So this plot that I'm showing you is basal area data. So basal area is, it's sort of a two-dimensional analog for biomass. You can think of basal area as really just the cross-sectional area of a tree. So if you had a tree, you cut it down and you measure the area of the stump, that's what basal area is. And it scales with biomass. So what we find is as we go from the forest interior, which is sort of this 20 to 30 meter segment from the forest edge, we see about a 64% increase in basal area or biomass in our urban plots. We don't find any change in mortality between the interior and the edge. And if you remember the slide I showed you a few minutes ago, that's in contrast to what's been observed in tropical forests and boreal forests. And in our rural sites, we find the same pattern, but the magnitude of that biomass enhancement is quite a bit larger. Here we see about a doubling in the amount of biomass between the interior and the edge. In our rural plots, we also extended these transects to go out to 50 meters. And what you can see is that by the time we get to this 20 to 30 meter segment, we're essentially at interior conditions, and it's pretty much a straight line after that. So then why do we see these differences between urban forests and rural forests. And so it's possible that there's just differences in urban and rural conditions, right? We know there's differences in pollution and atmospheric deposition, there's urban heat island, all sorts of things like that. There could also be differences in edaphic conditions, so just differences in the soil types themselves that can maybe influence a biomass response. And there could also be differences in forest age. And in this particular context, I think forest age, it winds up being really important. So from the tree cores, we know that our forests in our rural plots are about 40 years or so older than the forests in our urban plots. And that means that that edge has been there for 40 years longer. And so they've had more time to accumulate more biomass on the edge relative to the interior. And I think that's what's driving the dynamics here. So of course, if there's more biomass on the forest edge compared to the interior, that must also suggest that the trees in the forest themselves are growing faster. And indeed, that's what we find. And we find that for both our urban and rural plots, we get about a doubling in the rate of forest growth between the interior and edge. And because that rate of forest growth increase is similar between the two locations, that also suggests that differences in biomass that we see are sort of maybe more a function of time than of the other possibilities that I mentioned. So there's more biomass near the edge. The trees grow faster near the edge. The other thing that we found, so we have these tree cores, and so it gives us sort of this annual temporal resolution of how fast the forest is growing. And we can use that data to really get a better understanding for how the forests, as you go from the edge to the interior, how it's responding to different environmental signals. And so of course, we expect to see that there's variability in growth between years, right? That's what these ups and downs are. But what's really interesting is that those ups and downs become a lot larger as you get closer and closer to the edge. And so this is indicating that forests near the edge, there's something about the creation of an edge that makes, I guess, the good years really good and the bad years really bad, while the forest interior seems to be a little bit more even keeled. And we know that climate conditions play a really important role in mediating interannual variations in tree and forest growth. And so we looked at a variety of individual climate variables to see if there was one climate variable that sort of stood out as an important driver of this variability. And what we find is that it's heat stress. These forests seem to be particularly sensitive to heat stress. And the way we define heat stress here is the number of days in June and July, so the early part of the growing season, that are above 27 degrees Celsius. So this combination may sort of seem like it was a bit of a fishing expedition that got us to those numbers, but really June and July is when most wood production is produced in the trees. So that then seems like the right place to start for looking for some of these correlations. And 27 degrees Celsius is the average high temperature in July in this part of Massachusetts. And so anything above that represents perhaps conditions that are more stressful than what the trees are used to on average. And then on the y-axis here, this is basal area increment. You can sort of think of this as like kind of the donut of wood that a tree puts on around its circumference every year. So this is analogous with biomass. And what you find from going from the forest interior to the edge, of course, like I showed you earlier, growth rates increase. Across all three of these segments, or the interior, the sort of intermediate area, and then the forest edge area, they all growth rates decline across all those regions as you go from cooler years to hotter years. But that magnitude of change is considerably larger for the forest on the edge and in the interior. Right, so in our cool years, the forests on the edge are growing a whole lot faster than the forests in the interior. But during our hot years, that difference shrinks considerably. And so this is sort of suggesting that there's this interaction between land cover change and climate change that we really didn't know about or think about beforehand. And it suggests that edges could potentially increase the vulnerability of the forest carbon sink, so their capacity to sequester carbon, to a warming climate. The other thing that we found that's really interesting, the other thing is in some of this work, we ran some climate models out to the end of the century, sort of projecting out what heat stress looks like by the end of the century. And we find that because things are expected to get hotter, this large enhancement of forest growth that we currently see as a function of fragmentation, we can expect that to decline by about a third by the end of the century. So the other interesting piece is these plots that I'm showing you, that's for our urban forest locations. When we look at our rural locations, the species composition is similar. And while we see the same pattern in the magnitude of the growth response, we find that our rural forests aren't really particularly sensitive to heat stress in the interior. The creation of an edge makes them more sensitive to heat stress, but the magnitude of the decline in forest growth in response to heat stress is 3 times larger in our urban areas than it is in our rural areas. And so this is then indicating that there's something about urbanization that increases forest sensitivity to heat and can also exacerbate the influence of a forest edge on forest growth. And so prior to this work, most work had suggested that trees in urban areas grow faster than rural areas. And those data are all good and it's right. Like we find that in a lot of locations. But what we didn't really know is that while those trees are growing faster, they also seem to be more prone to getting stressed out by heat. And this is an important consideration as we move forward in time and thinking about the sort of the health and the productivity of our forests as our climate continues to warm. So I mentioned earlier that we also measured soil respiration, which is sort of a loss of carbon from the ecosystems. And what we find is that as we go from the forest interior to the edge, we get an increase in soil respiration. So there's an increase in carbon dioxide coming out of the soils. So on one hand, we see an increase in sequestration because the trees are growing faster. But on the other hand, we find an increase in respiration and an increase in the loss of CO2 from the soils. In the case of the soils, we know that metabolic activity in different organisms, including ourselves, is positively correlated to temperature. And from sensors that we have in these forests, we know that the distribution of temperatures is skewed to hotter conditions near the edge and in the interior. And so it makes sense then that soil respiration would also be higher near the edge simply because temperatures are hotter. It's also possible that the sensitivity of microbes and biological activity to temperature also changes near the edge. And so we looked at that, and that's a function called Q10. It's an exponential relationship between temperature and in this case, soil respiration, which is an indicator of metabolic activity. And we don't find any difference in that sensitivity to temperature. So this all suggests that it's really just the hotter conditions on the edge that are driving this increased loss of carbon from the soils. So now that we have a measurement of carbon uptake and sequestration and a measurement of carbon loss, we can use those 2 values to figure out what the net effect of fragmentation and the net effect of the creation of a forest edge is on a forest carbon budget. And so we call this net ecosystem productivity. And I put this in quotes because we're not capturing every aspect of ecosystem productivity, but we're capturing the biggest components of those carbon dynamics. And these 2 figures that I'm showing you, the top, this is that 0 to 10 meter segment from the forest edge. The bottom is that intermediate, that 10 to 20 meter segment. And each one of these is a plot where we have both the soil respiration data and the forest growth data. And the green, anything below 0, indicates net uptake, so sequestration of carbon, and the green is forest growth. The red is respiration, so that represents a net loss of carbon to the atmosphere. And this is all compared to forest interior conditions. And so what we find is if we sort of average across our plots in this edge segment, these forests still have, the edge creates a net increase in carbon sequestration of about 0.8 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. So what the hell does that mean? Well, so for context, these forests on average sequester somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. So this is a pretty substantial increase. It's anywhere from like maybe a third to a half to 50%. So that's a pretty large enhancement. When we look at that 10 to 20 meter segment, we see those same dynamics. It's muted just a little bit, but we still see a pretty important enhancement in carbon sequestration. And when we average across the two, here's the number that we get. So basically within 20 meters of an edge, we're seeing this large increase in net sequestration, while increases in soil respiration offset some of the gains made by faster forest growth. It certainly doesn't offset all of the gains made. And as a result, our fragmented forests, and we could think of them as being more productive per unit area than an intact forest. So you'll probably notice that we have a little bit of a difference between the way some of our plots are behaving versus others. So these plots 1 through 5, they have vegetated edges that look something like this picture that I'm showing you. But our plot that really stands out is plot 6 here. And this is what its edge looks like. So this is just a Google Street View image. Here's our plot on the right. And what we've noticed is from our temperature sensors that just having this small country road here is enough to increase the magnitude of warming at the forest edge compared to our other plots by 50% or more. So these edges are substantially warmer than these edges are. And so what that seems to result in is the forest segment right at the edge, actually we see a small decline in growth and a large increase in respiration. But that 10 to 20 meter segment, so what's normally sort of our intermediate segment of the forest, that seems to benefit from changes in conditions that the forest edge is not taking advantage of. And so they kind of are offsetting one another. So this is what we see at the plot level. And for a lot of my work, what I'm really interested in doing is taking these field measurements that we make and then using GIS and remote sensing data sets to better understand what this means at the landscape scale. So we scale some of our data up to the whole state of Massachusetts. We could do the same thing for New York. The forest types are similar, the dynamics are similar. And so in Massachusetts, we find that nearly 28% of the forest, about 1 million hectares of forest, are within 20 meters of an edge. And this, compared to our current approach to estimating carbon sequestration by forest that doesn't take into account the fact that edges tend to make forests more productive, we find that including this edge effect increases our estimate of the productivity of these forests by about 255,000 megagrams of carbon per year. For context, that's the same emissions as like tens of thousands of vehicles. So it's a pretty substantial thing to make sure you're accounting for properly. Usually at this point in the talk, I can't see the chat window, but usually someone scowls at me or something and asks me if I'm indicating that we should fragment the forest as a way to deal with climate change. And so I have to throw this disclaimer up there. And the reasons for this not being a good management strategy are twofold. First, we know from decades of research that fragmentation is generally terrible for biodiversity and wildlife. The second is, to reap the benefits of a fragmented forest, you have to lose forest to create that fragment. And what we find is that while these forest fragments are growing faster, they aren't growing fast enough to offset all of the carbon sequestration that gets lost when you deforest parts of the landscape to create those fragments to begin with. So the way I kind of think of this is, it's one of those things where maybe there's a little bit of a silver lining where we know forest fragmentation is bad for a lot of reasons, and maybe from a carbon cycling perspective, it's bad, but not as bad as we initially thought. We also find huge variations in the importance of fragmentation in different landscape contexts. So I have Boston here on the right. Everything that's red is forest within 20 meters of an edge. This is the area of forest that we know has altered carbon cycling. Everything in the blue is sort of our forest interior. And Petersham, Massachusetts, that's this green box up here. That's where Harvard Forest is. You can see there's a lot of intact forest. Boston here in the purple, of course, is highly fragmented. Concord is a suburb in between that still has quite a bit of fragmented forest. What we find is that in Boston, 80% of the forests are less than 20 meters of an edge. And so this means that the forest fragmentation dynamics there have huge implications for what our estimates of carbon sequestration looks like in forests of Boston. By contrast, because there's so little fragmentation and so few forest edges in this rural part of the state that we were looking at, while the magnitude of forest growth enhancement from forest edges is similar in a rural area, just because there isn't very much in the way of fragmentation, those dynamics don't play a really important role in sort of landscape scale carbon accounting. Here's some kind of really interesting new data from some colleagues of mine at Boston University, where they were looking at the soil respiration data that I showed you a couple of slides ago, and they've been making those measurements in urban areas too. And so the black, this is similar to what I showed you, where we see this increase in respiration in the rural area. But what they're finding in urban areas, there's actually a decline in respiration near the edge. And if that's true, and if that really holds up, that suggests that the magnitude of the increase in the forest carbon sink in urban areas as a function of fragmentation is even larger than what I'm showing you here. And so from all this, I think a big take-home message is really that per unit forest area, our urban forests are substantially more productive than our rural forests. So they're really doing hitting above their weight and doing a lot more per unit area than our rural forests are. But because they are more sensitive to heat, they're also likely to be disproportionately negatively impacted by climate change, right? So there's all these different parts and pieces moving in different directions that we need to kind of hold and think about simultaneously as we move forward in time, and thinking about how do we manage forests across our landscape? How do we sort of predict how much carbon they're going to remove from the atmosphere, and what does that all mean for climate change, and what does it mean for feedbacks between the climate and the forest ecosystems that we rely on quite heavily for everything from recreation to a suite of different ecosystem services. So where we want to go with all of this is to kind of come up with a framework for predicting how forests in different parts of the world respond to fragmentation. Here's a revised version of a figure that came out of a paper in 2003, where across the planet, they sort of categorized different regions by the environmental factors that were limiting rates of plant productivity. And they broke it down into light limiting factors, temperature, and water. And of course, you can have combinations of all of these. And because we know that fragmentation alters all of those, what we're hoping to get to is a point where we can say, okay, here's what's limiting forest growth in this part of the world. We know how microenvironment and growing conditions change when you create a forest edge. Can we pull those data sets together and then sort of predict how forest fragmentation might alter carbon cycling in that region? And so really what we want to do is take our forest plots that I've been showing you some data from in Massachusetts and think about how do we make that next leap in spatial scale? How do we go from this one small state to the planet? And to do that, we really need to understand some of the mechanisms driving this forest growth response. And we also need data from a larger geographical area. And so we've been chipping away at these two, and I'll just share some data with that. So for the mechanistic drivers, like I showed you earlier, we expect that light is driving an increase in growth. And so a way that we measure this is we go out into the forest and we use these hemispherical photos, like I'm showing you an image up here on the left. And we can use that to quantify how much light is being absorbed by the canopy. And we know that there's really good positive correlations between the amount of light being absorbed and how productive a forest is. And what you can see here from our data, So as you go from the forest interior to the edge, there is an increase in the amount of light that gets absorbed. This suggests that there's an increase in leaf area, so just the total surface area of leaves at the edge compared to the interior. So then we need to make the leap from that to forest growth. So what we find is across the plots where we have both growth and these hemispherical photo data, that at the forest edge and that intermediate area, there's a really strong positive correlation between the increase in canopy light absorption compared to the forest interior and that increase in growth compared to the forest interior. So essentially, this plot up here, if we compare the data for growth and light interception to the forest interior, we find that both the magnitude of increase in light absorption and the magnitude of forest growth enhancement are substantially larger at the edge and in the interior than what we find down here, right? So this is suggesting that light and the forest response to that increase in light availability seems to be kind of a proximate mechanism for what controls the magnitude of the forest growth response. But we also see that it varies a lot between plots. And so we're trying to better understand why you don't have all forests, even though they're in relatively close geographic proximity to one another. We don't know why they all respond a little bit differently from one another. It could be things like differences in nutrient availability. Maybe a more nutrient-rich site just has the capacity to put out more leaves when an edge is created. Or maybe there's some microclimate piece in here, like I showed you earlier. Maybe forests next to some sort of development get quite a bit hotter, and that can maybe offset some of the benefits of higher light. So these are the things that we're still trying to tease apart. One thing that we looked at is we know from previous work that soils and air tends to be drier at the edge. And we expected that those drier conditions would then reduce the capacity of forests to respond to an edge by increasing leaf area. But what's interesting is that we found the opposite. So here I'm showing you soil moisture relative to the forest interior on the x-axis here. So anything above 1 means that the soils are wetter than the interior, less than 1, it's drier than the interior. And that the y-axis here is canopy light absorption. Again, this is relative to the plot mean. And actually what we find is that the sites that seem to absorb more light and have higher leaf area, those soils are actually drier than the ones that have lower leaf area. And so it seems really what's happening is that it's not that the drier conditions seem to be controlling the leaf area response. It's rather that by virtue of the fact that these forests here have more leaves, essentially, that their demand for water increases, and that seems to be drying out the soil. So that was sort of unexpected. The other thing is this temperature piece. So I mentioned earlier that forest edges are hotter than the interior. Here's some data showing that we get about a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature between the interior and the edge. That's on par with the amount of warming that we've seen over the past 100 years or so from climate change. So it's a pretty substantial change to have just over the course of 30 meters. And we find that as exposure to extreme heat increases, the capacity of trees to increase leaf area along the edge and take up more of that light seems to decrease. So this is suggestive that the hot temperatures themselves near the edge could be impeding or impairing the benefits reaped from higher light. And of course, given the relationship between light absorbance and growth, we also find that our sites that tend to have hotter edges, they seem to have a much lower growth enhancement on the edge than those that tend to be cooler. Okay, so the next thing that we think about doing, this is where I'll sort of finish up, is we need to move beyond New England. And I guess that's appropriate because that's sort of, I guess, what the Democratic Party needs to do politically as well. But so how do we do that? So the way we've been doing that, and this is the topic of a paper that's currently review in Nature, fingers crossed, I'm sure it'll get rejected in the next couple of days, but you don't know unless if you don't try, right? So to do this, we've been taking advantage of big data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, that's FIA. And what this is, it's probably the most data-rich forest inventory program of any country in the world. Basically, the US is broken down into 6,000 acre hexagons. And in each of these hexagons is a plot that gets randomly located. And you have field crews that go out to these plots every few years and measure things like forest biomass, species composition, things like that. This image on the right is just a schematic of what their sampling design looks like. Across the US, there's over 360,000 of these hexagons. And then in the Northeast US, the Northeast quarter to 20 state region, there's about 48,000 of them. And that's what we focused on for our analyses here that I'm going to talk about. 20% of these plots get measured each year, so that in any 5-year period, every plot gets remeasured. There's now also an urban FIA program. The approach is a little bit different. This is showing the scattering of where these urban FIA sites exist, and we have one in New York City that went online in 2018. But we didn't use those data for this analysis because the way the data are collected is a little bit different. Okay, so here's that 20-state region that I was talking about outlined in red. And we looked at, because there's tens of thousands of plots, we can look at a range of different forest types, and we have a huge N to be able to distinguish differences. And what you can see across the board is that when we compare our interior forests here in these like bluish green dots to our anthropogenic edges, so that's similar to what I've been showing you where it's development or agriculture, we see that same pattern of this pretty large enhancement in basal area, and it's pretty, it exists pretty much across forest types in the eastern US. We see the same thing for growth, right? The magnitude of growth, it varies a little bit by forest type, but for pretty much all forest types, we see a significant increase in growth. And so this like really helps us to realize that what we've been seeing isn't really just like an anomaly in New England for oak maple dominated forests. This is something that we see across forest types. So then we take those data and we break the northeastern US into different ecoregions. So these are just geographic delineations based on some sort of ecological attribute of an area. And within each of these ecoregions, we can quantify the proportion of the forest that is edge. And you can see, you know, a lot of the agricultural Midwest, there's a lot of edge. You can see like the Adirondacks, there's very little edge, right? So there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity. And then we can take our FIA data and look at, okay, well, what's the forest growth enhancement as a function of an edge in these different ecoregions? And then we can tie that together and figure out, okay, well, what's the percent increase in growth by ecoregion? And this allows you in a sort of spatially explicit way to see where forest edges are more important for influencing our overall estimate of carbon sequestration compared to others. And then we can put this in some sort of a global context. And so globally, the temperate forest outlined in black, both in the northern and the southern hemisphere, they're nearly twice as fragmented as our tropical forests. And we know that in tropical forests, there's a decline in biomass and decline in growth when you create an edge. But in our temperate forest, there's an increase. And partially because of the magnitude of the forest growth response to edges in the temperate region and just the magnitude of fragmentation in the temperate region, that suggests that increases in growth from fragmentation in the temperate region can actually be really important in essentially offsetting declines in growth from fragmentation in the tropical region. So these are things that we really need to start thinking about as we try to improve our capacity to estimate sort of global carbon balance. All right. So moving forward, some other things that we're working on related to this. We're working with hyperspectral physicists at NIST to try and improve our capacity to measure these things and sort of measure these things almost in real time. So we have a forest site set up on their campus in Gaithersburg, Maryland. We're making a suite of different ecophysiological measurements, so things like water movement through the tree, rates of photosynthesis, rates of tree growth. And then we're using hyperspectral measurements, and particularly we'll look at a variable called solar-induced fluorescence, which has been inferred to be connected to rates of photosynthesis. So it could potentially be like a proxy sort of way to measure photosynthesis remotely. You can see sort of our setup here. Here's our telescope with a fiber optic, and we can zoom into a part of the forest canopy and measure the solar-induced fluorescence kind of real time. And we're hoping that by building these connections between this remote sensing data and what we measure in the field, that will allow us, by building those connections, it'll help to improve our capacity to measure carbon cycling, especially in urban forest patches, which are particularly difficult to measure because we can't always put expensive equipment there. They're oftentimes on property that is not well set up to doing research, but there's a lot of uncertainty in our understanding of how they grow and how they cycle carbon. So we're hoping these sorts of approaches can improve our understanding there. I'm also getting ready to submit a new proposal to NSF to try and better understand some of these mechanisms. And so some of the things that we think about here that drives a lot of this is on the forest edge. As I'm showing you in this picture here, there's a field to the right. We see this really big difference in the structure of the trees and the structure of the forest. You can see all of these large lateral branches. And we think that can be used to sort of predict at a landscape scale how forests are responding to an edge. And so we're planning on integrating these sorts of field measurements with airborne and UAV technologies using LiDAR to get at forest structure in a spatially resolved way. And so sort of we hypothesize here that the edges sort of induce these shifts in forest structure that are correlated with productivity and biomass, and that by building these correlations, we can use landscape scale or even satellite-based LiDAR data to measure these things across large portions of the landscape. And here's just what some of this LiDAR data would look like. Here's one of our plots. This is a field. Different colors indicate different heights of the canopy, and each one of these points is sort of what the LiDAR was hitting. So it gives us this information about structure that we can link to field measurements of biomass. Our drone data even gives us even better spatial resolution of structure. So we're hoping to kind of try and bridge these two different technologies together. All right, so just some quick take-home messages. So the world's forests are highly fragmented. We know that the response to the creation of edges varies considerably across biomes, but hopefully I've convinced you that in the temperate region, things are kind of unique, and the creation of an edge seems to increase LAI, which is, sorry to have an acronym in here, it just stands for leaf area index, and it's basically the amount of leaf surface area in the forest. It increases soil respiration, so that's carbon loss from the soil. And it also increases carbon storage, carbon uptake, and just overall rates of carbon cycling in the forest. And we see this across different forest types within the temperate region. But it's also important to consider that there are these critical interactions among forest fragmentation, urbanization, and climate change. And then what I want to leave you with is that we can't accurately characterize landscape, regional, or global forest carbon balance or budgets and the response of these systems to climate without considering the role that fragmentation plays in all of this. And then what I like to do at the end here is kind of try and bridge the science to why it's important from a societal perspective. And improved carbon accounting is really is essential for meeting climate change and sustainability objectives. So just as an example of that, the New York State has one of the most ambitious plans to curb or mitigate climate change, at least from what the state has control over. And it looks at things for carbon emissions from land use change and from sequestration and terrestrial ecosystems, but these are pieces that are the most uncertain components of our carbon budget. And that uncertainty increases as we get to finer and finer spatial scales. And a big piece of this legislation is that the state would eliminate net greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't mean no greenhouse gas emissions. It just essentially means that they're relying on terrestrial ecosystems to offset whatever they can't eliminate. And if we're going to get that number right and know how much we have to reduce our emissions to for our terrestrial ecosystems to offset it, we really need to get the accounting right and understand what our forests are doing. And given how fragmented our landscape is and how important that can be in overall carbon sequestration, that piece needs to be incorporated into that. And so I feel like this sort of work and understanding these dynamics is really important to helping us meet some of these objectives. And I'll also highlight that another piece here is transportation is almost half of our emissions, and that's also the most difficult one to measure, right? We at a global scale, we can figure out sort of how much oil was consumed, how much was burned, and we know how much CO2 that puts in the atmosphere. But when someone fills up their gas tank in New York City, you don't know if they're driving all of their miles in New York City or if they're driving across the country. And that has very different implications for New York's carbon budget. And so one of the ways scientists go about monitoring this is you can look at CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and attribute sort of anomalies in CO2, so maybe increases in CO2 in the atmosphere, attribute that to different sources and sinks. And like in cities, you get this increase in CO2 in the atmosphere that's largely driven by fossil fuel emissions, but there's a lot of biology in urban systems, and those forests are removing carbon from the atmosphere, and you need to be able to accurately quantify what those ecosystems are doing for you to appropriately be able to attribute increases in CO2 in the atmosphere to fossil fuel emissions. Also, a piece of this is thinking about sustainability. New York City had the Million Trees Project. We can quantify what that means for carbon sequestration, and urban reforestation can be can play an important role in carbon sequestration. But the numbers that they generate don't take into account the fact that these trees actually grow considerably faster than a rural tree does. But at the same time, the climate implications and the increased sensitivity of these trees to warming also needs to be considered when we're thinking about the broader sustainability of these different approaches that we're taking. So with that, I think maybe we still have 10 minutes or so for questions. So I'm more than happy to answer anything you want to throw at me.
Thank you. That was great. Wow. I was taking notes. So at this point, people can start typing in some notes, some questions, or you can just turn on your microphone and just ask the question that way. Okay.
We got a relatively small bunch today, so we could probably do voice questions.
Yeah, exactly.
I got one. Thanks for the talk. I guess my question is, how does this model, I guess, of edge effects fit in with like the stages of forest succession? Because I know that you said that, you know, there's like an increase in size on trees at the edge, but then I would also anticipate that you would also have like an increase in like a shift in like the like successional stages. Like we'd have like more like primary species. And I just
That's a great question, and that's one of the components that we're building into this proposal that we're submitting in a few weeks. And so I think I don't have an answer for you, but I think there's a lot of things that factor into what that looks like. First, there's did the forest grow up along an edge, or was it an intact forest that had an edge carved out of it, right? So for example, in some rural landscapes that had an agricultural history, and then after agricultural abandonment, you had a lot of forest growing back, but they grew up on edges. It's possible that the composition of the forest there might be heavily influenced by just the gradients and light availability. If you contrast that to maybe a lot of our suburban areas where agriculture was abandoned, trees grew back, then the suburbs came in, and then we sort of carved out our house lots into the forest. In that case, you were dealing with a mature forest, and given that these tree species tend to live for a couple of hundred years, we may not expect to see that same shift in tree species composition that we might if the forest sort of grew up on the edge. So I think there's a lot of things that go into what those dynamics look like. I think where they have really important implications is in how they can possibly mediate what that growth response looks like. So there was some really cool research about 20 years ago or so where they looked at individual trees, how the tree structure, the canopy structure responded to an edge. And what they found is that the shade tolerant species, which are typically our late successional species, they had a much greater capacity to put out these large lateral branches and increase leaf area and things like that than the early successional species that tended to have smaller crowns and didn't really have that same capacity to put out those large branches. So from that, I would expect, and actually one of our hypotheses is that if you have a forest edge that is dominated by more shade tolerant species, you should also get a larger forest growth enhancement than if it was dominated by early successional species. But so through a combination of field measurements and also just mining the forest inventory and analysis database, we're hoping to be able to get at some of those things. That's an awesome question.
Thank you.
So, hi, Andy. I'm sorry I came late. Missed half your talk. My one question. So, that's very good. For the edge effect, maybe related to how tall of the forest of the trees.
Yep.
Do you have any data show the relationship between this edge effect depends on how far you see the distance. So taller maybe the distance would be longer. So do you have any data or any something about that?
Yeah. That's also a good question. So for the most part, the forests that we look at, these eastern broadleaf forests, they tend to be 25 to 30 meter tall canopies, and they're largely pretty similar, plus or minus about 5 meters. So there's not, unless we looked at a much younger forest with smaller stature trees, there's not a lot to go on there to look at canopy height. But if we look at across biomes, then we can see these things play out. So for example, one of the reasons why they think that in tropical forests, the distance that these edge effects propagate into the interior, in those cases, it can be maybe up to 100 meters. Part of the reason is because those trees are so much taller. And one rule of thumb is that the depth of propagation of edge effects is something on the order of whatever the height of your trees might be. So of course, trees in the tropics are not 100 meters tall, but they could be 40 or 50 meters tall. And so when you create that edge, that also means that there's sort of a lot of space between the top of the canopy and the ground for some of those conditions to sort of work their way into the forest interior. Of course, in the tropics, when you create an edge, you radically alter the Bowen ratio between the forest and the adjacent land cover, and that plays a really big role in how deep these edge effects propagate in the tropics. Another place where we have some evidence for this is in the 90s, there was some work done in the Pacific Northwest and some of those temperate rainforests. And there you have trees pushing 60 meters tall, and those trees blow over. Like at some point, the trees get too tall, especially if they have their leaves on year round, where they just become so much more susceptible to wind throw that you get a lot more mortality near the edge. So I think in the temperate region, they're sort of in this sweet spot where it's cool enough and wet enough that things getting hotter and drier aren't terrible. And the trees themselves are just short enough and deeply rooted enough that they don't get blown over super easily. and they have leaves on for only a few months of the year, which just reduces the amount of time that they're exposed to higher winds. So that's sort of a long answer to your question. Certainly the height of the trees does seem to play a role, but I don't know of a quantitative study where they directly compare this across forests with different height structures.
Another very interesting data you show about contrast between urban and rural for the soil respiration. You see at age, yeah, this one in urban that's very small. In the rural looks pretty high for the soil respiration. I think you give some explanation. I maybe missed something. Could you, so why is so big difference between urban and rural?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't know the answer to that yet. And that was some preliminary data. There's likely differences in soil texture. So it's possible that in an urban landscape, oftentimes it's next to some sort of development, and there's probably some type of fill soil mixing in with native soil at the edge that can change the texture, maybe pH and things like that. And that could potentially be altering rates of soil respiration. But it's not immediately clear why there's that decline. So stay tuned. I'm pretty intrigued by that. We're going to start making similar measurements in New York City, hopefully next summer if the world is normal again. And so hopefully I can give you a little bit more insight into what the mechanisms are. But we were all really surprised to see that difference, because we don't see a difference in the tree response, but we do see a difference in the soil response.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have a question from Gottfried. Okay, seeing that the edge effects can both be beneficial and detrimental to the forest's carbon pool, what are some of the strategies we can take to ensure that these edge effects are more beneficial to the forest carbon pool?
Don't put pavement next to them. It seems like the thing that stands out most as potentially limiting the enhancement of growth at the forest edge is how hot things are. And that seems to be pretty closely correlated to whether the adjacent land cover type is an impervious surface or a vegetated surface. So if around our urban parks, if there could be some sort of vegetation and not an abrupt transition to sidewalks, roads, buildings, and parking lots, I suspect that we can reduce the vulnerability of those forests to heat and hopefully maximize their potential to sequester carbon. I think that would probably be the biggest thing.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Good question.
Yeah, that was great.
Any other questions? Okay. I guess everyone has other things on their mind, could be.
Yeah.
That was a great talk. Thank you. Wow.
Yeah, thank you guys. This was fun, and a good distraction for me too.
Exactly. So